We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back discussing grievance culture and its impact on society with Professor Mark Milke, author of The Victim Cult. You know, I seem to have these conversations about how victim groups, I guess they call the people, self-professed victim groups. And as you rightly point out, they don't ever tend to internalize or speak directly to their oppressor. That it's more a question of destroying the outward signs of the historical oppression. And we've seen this a lot in both your country, my country, in the United States. It's one thing that always pops into my head is George Orwell's 1984 and how the past has become mutable under the powers to fit the present narrative, whether that's statues, books. And it's the changeability of narrative that creates such discord between those who see themselves as victims, as a group or as individuals, and those that are being held responsible. Now, in your estimation, is the ability to change the past to impact the present and future inherent in keeping the victim cult alive and strong? Does that make sense?
Well, let me answer that slightly different way. Let's go back to your point about people who, in essence, are attacking the past, right, by attacking statues. I mean, it's a really weird modern ideology to try and cleanse the past. I mean, we talked about Marxists a moment ago. In the 20th century, at least, in the 19th century, Marxists look forward to a perfect utopia, trying to create heaven on earth. I mean, what do modern sort of victim cultists do? Those who attack statues or blame the past for all present outcomes. In essence, what they're trying to do is create a perfect past. I mean, at least Marxists look forward and you know, in the future thought they could change the future. You've got people who actually think by attacking statues or, I don't know, rewriting entire historical accounts that they can sort of cleanse the past of evil or cleanse the past of these clashes between various groups, you know, ours, yours, mine, whatever. It's a really weird utopian ideology as applied to the past. It makes even less sense than Marxism, which at least, you know, was utopian about the future. So that's one part of the victim cult where, well, who would expect the past to be perfect? I mean, my grandmother left Ukraine as a 3-year-old in 1914, tried to get to Canada with her family, obviously. Was prevented by doing so by the outbreak of war at the port of, at a port in Latvia. Her and her family ended up traveling around Central Europe and then Siberia for literally about 13, 14 years before coming to Canada. She was a victim, for sure. But she didn't get stuck there. She never even learned how to read or write. I mean, for years, she would mark documents with an X, and I first noticed this as a kid and asked my parents about it. And they said, well, Grandma never got to go to school. So there are real victims in history. But somehow her and my grandfather, who was a German that came from Poland in the 1920s, managed to carve out a life in Canada. Now, this is the typical American, Canadian and American, and you know, there's immigrant success stories in the UK as well. These are typical immigrant success stories. But what they point to is the possibility to say, we're not going to deny that bad things have happened in the past, tragedies, but we better figure out how to not get stuck there, to acknowledge it, to make up for it where you can. If you stepped on my foot yesterday and break my toe, you might want to pay for my surgery today. But beyond that, we don't want to hang on to the past too tightly.
So would you say that the book, The Victim Cult, is it more a warning about what could happen if the dark path is followed, or is it a roadmap for people to break out of this particular mindset? Or
well, I would say the former.
Okay.
I would say the former. I don't really do a Tony Robbins, with due respect, 1, 2, 3, here's how you get out of your situation. It really is kind of an historical and cultural account saying, look, this is a phenomenon in history. In Rwanda, you had people of the same color, but who consider themselves different ethnicities, Hutu and Tutsis, pick on each other. First, the Tutsis on the Hutus, pre-1960, pre-independence, and then the Hutus, who blamed everything, their outcomes, any negative outcomes, on Tutsi rule before 1960. And they did this for 30, 35 years through the state, through propaganda, through the media. And we know where that ended in 1993 with genocide in Rwanda. And so this notion that I'm a victim or that my tribe is a victim, again, even if true, and there's usually some truth to this notion, that one has been a victim, or one's tribe, one's whatever you want to call it, has been victimized at some point in history. Again, given the history of the world. But the danger of getting stuck there, and the victim cult is about warning against letting people and politicians and those in the media carry that narrative along, because that can be very destructive. And it makes the same mistake. Let's suppose your tribe has been oppressed, whether your tribe is ethnic, racial, whatever it is, or gender. Let's suppose that's true. Well, what happened was you were not treated as an individual, or your ancestors were not treated as individuals. They were not looked at as individuals. And for us today, for someone to glom onto that, though, and say, because my tribe was not treated properly, those who came before me were not treated as individuals in this society. And Black Americans are an obvious example. Well, but to turn that around and to not treat others as individuals today is to make the same mistake that racists in the past made. So it's a very dangerous road to trod, and it leads to bad outcomes, to say the least.
Well, what are some of the other themes that you explore in the victim cult?
Well, one of the ironies is that you have even an entire class, a chattering class today, that blames any outcomes between groups when you measure, white Americans versus Asian Americans versus Black Americans versus Mexican Americans, any differences in outcomes. They blame it on, again, racism. It's monocausal. You'll see, various, prominent Black authors do this. Not all of them. There are plenty of exceptions. Thomas Sowell, Walter Williams, and others. Glenn Laurie, John McWhorter just wrote a book on this. But you do have, some authors that blame everything on racism. Well, that's a mistake. But there's also, and so I go into that in the book as well. And you'll see actually that, look, if everything's due to racism, how do you explain again the prominence of, say, East Indian Americans in the census data that have the highest incomes of anyone? And then those from Taiwan ancestry, those of Chinese ancestry more generally, or Japanese ancestry, or Korean. Those are at the top of the income heap. And there's a reason for that. It's because generally they have the highest education levels in American society, and that leads to higher incomes. So I try and dispel this notion that everything that is different between outcomes between groups and data is due to racism. It's not. I also go into this notion, again, from the chattering classes, that Western civilization is to blame somehow for an imperfect society. I mean, whether you live in the United Kingdom as you do, or in Canada as I do, or in the United States, we live in one of the most prosperous, flourishing times compared to any year in history, compared to any century in history. It's not perfect. We live in an imperfect world. We are imperfect human beings. But we should be grateful for the age we live in, despite a pandemic, despite what governments do, despite mistakes, despite wars and tragedy. We've had it pretty good compared to most people in human history. And so, but we've got an entire chattering class that thinks we live in this dystopian, racist society that somehow is oppressive. That's simply not true by any historical account. So I go into that. But the irony of that is these chattering classes, who also blame everything on people with, how can I put this, pale palettes, like mine and yours. The same thinkers that do this and blame Europeans or the Brits, colonialists, for any bad outcomes, take their ideas from Europeans, except they take it from Frantz Fanon, or they take it from, other European thinkers of, 50 and 60 years ago that just thought the West was, irredeemably evil. And so the irony is, if you want to blame sort of some bad outcomes today on Europeans, go ahead, but you should be blaming them on, French postmodernists and not early American thinkers, or, Adam Smith, or Abraham Lincoln, just because Abraham Lincoln lived in an imperfect age where there was still plenty of racism, post-Civil War, and plenty of oppression against Black Americans. So we live in this weird age where people again want to blame people based on skin color, instead of drawing the correct lesson that in past ages, people as individuals were not treated correctly because they had the wrong skin color. They were Black in 1865. But people don't draw the right lessons from that, or 1965 and Martin Luther King, in 1963, before that came to prominence. People don't draw the right lessons from history, which is don't make the same mistake and treat people as anything other than individuals in law and policy. But you've got plenty of voices today that somehow want to make up for past wrongs by really awarding jobs and incomes and college spots at Harvard based on race. That's utterly destructive.
Professor Mark Milke, author of the new book, The Victim Cult, How the Grievance Culture Hurts Everyone and Wrecks Civilizations. So, Mark, please note, where can people get a copy of your book or follow you for your writings?
Victimcult.com. They can also find me on LinkedIn, Twitter, the usual social media channels. But victimcult.com is probably the best place to find out where you can find the book. It's all over America and bookstores and Amazon. But victimcult.com is where you can find the Victim Cult.
Thanks ever so much. Very fascinating.
Thank you, Mark.
You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard across the Radio America network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. Remember, you can tune in for Liberty Nation from 2 to 3 p.m. Sunday on KBKW 103.5 FM, 1450 AM, the talk of Grays Harbor. Coming up later in the show, we're talking liberty and cancel culture with Scott D. Cosenza. But up next, Orwellian Nightmares with Sarah Cowgill. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're doing it for real, really real. Liberty Nation.
And Jeff Charles, contributor for LibertyNation.com.
I think we're starting to make an impact. Liberty style, fight for freedom.
The tracking poll sponsored by Liberty Nation for Thursday.
Mentioned by Dan Bongino, Rasmussen, Jordan Peterson, and
I
others.
can do it again if you want me to.
Cited in Mark Levin's American Marxism.
I think we're starting to make a really big impact. Get noticed. We're doing it. Rock on. I'm gone.